Hey team, and welcome to another video in the Astrological Magical Elections video series. Today we're going to talk about the magical elections that are going to be available to us between the Gemini New Moon on May 22nd to the Sagittarius Full Moon on June 5th. So unfortunately there isn't really a whole lot going on during this 2-week period, and the reason for that are mostly things that I covered in the Mercury and Gemini magical elections video. Just we're having to deal with 3 planets that have decided to turn retrograde on us: Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn. So when 3 out of your 6 planets that the moon can apply to turn retrograde, you kind of lose a lot of options that you have. At the same time, because Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn have gone retrograde, we're unable to use the signs Capricorn, Aquarius, Sagittarius, Pisces, and Libra and Taurus as rising signs for any sort of magical election. So, you kind of have your hands tied for the most part of it. So for more information about, the kind of unique challenges that retrograde planets present in magical elections, make sure to go check out that Mercury and Gemini video. I won't be talking about Mercury's transit in Gemini or any potential election opportunities that there may be, so go and check out the video to see kind of why or why not you may have an opportunity for a Mercury talisman. And so because there aren't very many magical electional opportunities for this 2-week period, we have one for Western Europe and one for Australia, but none for North America. We're kind of not doing very well here in North America, so we just don't get to have any magical elections lately, it seems. But because there's not a whole lot, I did want to take a second to talk about kind of a different topic, kind of related to magical elections or just kind of astrological magic or planetary magic in general. And this is a question that was posed to me by one of my patrons, David. And so David writes, Romans and Greeks seem to use synthemata and make prayers for their amulets. I haven't really seen any mention of talismans and picatrix. When I make talismans, the presence of the spirit can be very heavy and apparent. It's a strong connection, but I would like to sort of have a lighter connection and not ensoul the spirit in stones, pendants, rings, and god images I own. I could use the 4-note method or try a consecration that doesn't utilize ensoulment. So my question is, do we have any other way to create a connection between a material substance and a planet, but not use ensoulment in the talisman creation process? So this is a really great question, but it kind of allows us to have some kind of deeper philosophical conversations behind it to be able to make the answer make a little bit more sense. Excuse me, my air conditioner has come on. So primarily what David is asking is there a way for astrological magicians to utilize planetary magic without necessarily resorting to ensoulment in a talismanic object? And the question here is a little bit complicated to answer because it requires us to kind of dig into the metaphysics of what we're doing specifically. So historically, magic is kind of subdivided into these 2 distinct schools of thought. The first is natural magic, and the other is, I guess you would call it like ritual magic or image magic perhaps. Natural magic is the idea that there is a inherent occult or magical properties of items that exist in the world around us, and we can just utilize them by utilizing those objects. Image magic is more along the idea of summoning up spirits and utilizing them or, petitioning them for aid in some sort of matter that we're working with, kind of petitioning them to intercede on our behalf or to do, work their magic to fix whatever problem we're having or to give us greater insight into whatever situation we're faced with. There's some kind of religious differences here, at least insofar as the Christian church in the past, to where natural magic was often argued as being much more acceptable of an avenue for people to explore, whereas image magic was often seen, if one of the 2 categories was going to be seen as, the realm of demons, and it was going to be the image magic, which specifically talked about the invocations of angels or other celestial spirits to help intercede on somebody's behalf. But natural magic is a lot harder to police, and it's a little bit easier to argue from a religious kind of theological standpoint. The basic idea is that plants and stones have specific powers that they just have as a part of their character. Like, it's just, they didn't ask for it. There's nothing that you necessarily have to do to access those powers, but they just have that ability, and that's all there is to it. Obviously it's been put here by some higher power for us to be able to access in that way. Kind of the best example that I can think of is really when it comes to like herbal medicines. It isn't the fact that there's any sort of ritual magic that needs to be, You okay, Blossom? You okay? You just fall out of bed and scare yourself? Huh, that scared me. The best example of natural magic, which is something that we still kind of recognize today, is the idea of herbal remedies. We use St. John's wort typically to treat symptoms of depression. So, there's nothing kind of inherently magical or ritualistic that you need to do to be able to utilize St. John's wort in that manner. It has those own properties kind of innately within itself, and all you have to do is know, proper dosage and how to take that herb, and you can access those properties. And that's kind of the basic idea, just that you can access the powers or capabilities of these different herbs or stones without, really needing to do any sort of invocations about them. You don't need to ask a spirit of a plant to do that for you. The plant just does it, naturally. And that's basically the idea of natural magic. You access that either, medicinally through medicinal herbs, or even medicinal stones in some cases, or you can do it through a little bit more, almost like occulty, almost like directly magical ideas. Like carrying rubies helps resist poison and the plague. There's nothing inherently, ritualistic that you need to do to be able to access that property of rubies. Just carrying the ruby's own innate powers and own innate connections with other celestial entities helps to create that bridge and create that power for you. The ideas within natural magic are powered primarily through the concept of synthemata, the idea that a planet has rulership over specific plants and stones, and the plants and stones get those medicinal or occult properties from that connection through that planet. Plants that are associated with the sun often have to do with resisting poisons, curing depression, things like that, like typically solar-powered influences. So kind of to answer the question more directly, do we have any other way to create a connection between a material substance and a planet that doesn't necessarily utilize the ensoulment process? Yes, because synthemata dictates that all materials in the physical world are directly connected to a planet. And so it's up to us as astrological magicians to help to strengthen that connection between the substance and the celestial spirit that we're trying to operate with. This is kind of the union of the natural magical world of, using amethyst to connect to the planet Jupiter, because there is a natural synthematic connection between Jupiter and amethyst that gives amethyst its magical properties and potencies, and the more ritual invocation magic, wherein, you can utilize sigils and images of Jupiter carved onto amethysts to amplify that connection. Or if you didn't necessarily want to go that route, you could empower amethyst or some other stone of Jupiter by soaking it in Jupiter hydrosols, or, anointing it with Jupiter oils or anything like that. So there's definitely a way to strengthen connections that don't necessarily involve ensoulment, because the idea, basically when it comes to planetary magic, there really shouldn't be a ensoulment process necessarily. And this is something that I've kind of been on the fence about a little bit, because synthemata, that whole doctrine dictates that the connection between material objects and planets is innate. It's inherent. Like, it's not something that you force into or you capture. It's something that you awaken. But that's an argument that I can make much more clearly, much more certainly with planetary magic. In a way that I don't think I necessarily really could through fixed stars or Lunar Mansion talismans, because planetary talismans are connected to the spirits of planets, which are keyed in much more closely to the synthematic principle that everything in the universe, all manner of plant, animals, people, and stones, directly kind of derive some sort of spiritual connection between themselves and planets that most accurately or most completely represent them in some way. So in most cases, your planetary magic is going to be more aligned with the natural kind of awakening method, to where you have, like I kind of mentioned before, the example before, where you have an amethyst stone, which kind of naturally, innately has a connection with Jupiter, but to transform that into a Jupiter talisman, you combine that with Jupiter imagery, with other Jupiter materia, oils, hydrosols, plants, incense, along with the celestial timing method of a good Jupiter election, which we won't have until Jupiter gets into Pisces, to help kind of consecrate and make that stone and kind of empower that stone or awaken that connection more concretely and more meaningfully. Now, the ensoulment process is something that's a little bit different, because with planetary talismans, I don't really think that's what's happening specifically. But when it comes to like fixed star talismans and Lunar Mansion talismans, that probably is more of a correct explanation or description of the process that's involved, especially since Lunar Mansion talismans don't have the stones or even the herb associations that planets and stars tend to do. A lot of the Lunar Mansion talismans have just like suffumigations or aromas associated with them, which are not concrete physical things. Fixed stars, while they don't necessarily have the same breadth of amount of objects that are associated with them, usually just one stone or one herb, they do have kind of that connection a little bit more pronounced than the lunar mansions, but obviously much less so than the planetary talismans. So all of that to say, there is definitely an avenue of planetary magic that is not specifically about ensoulment or the invocation of celestial spirits, but it is more aligned with the planetary magic nature of connecting and strengthening those inherent spiritual connections between objects in the material world to the celestial world. I also think there might be a deeper kind of background theological influence to where especially a lot of the medieval Latin Western texts that might have been influenced by Picatrix kind of speak about the magical and ritual process as if it was coming from like a proto-Solomonic place, like the idea that celestial spirits are things to be invoked and summoned up and commanded and, be like directed, that kind of thing. It's sort of like in the name of Jesus, do this, that, and that for me, because God is the ultimate creator and all the spirits are subservient to him. And so, we as humans can kind of tap into that to assert our will over these celestial spirits, which normally are kind of higher up in the hierarchy than we are. You don't really find that in the Greek magical texts of, like Iamblichus and other theurgists who focused obviously more on theurgy, the idea of the inherent spiritual connection between things and kind of paying respect to those different levels of hierarchy rather than trying to jump ahead or above due to name dropping. But that's a whole other discussion that I may or may not even be close to correct on. It's just an interesting kind of trend that I noticed. But all that, I'm really glad I got to kind of talk about this kind of niche metaphysical philosophical thing. So thank you so much for the question. And hopefully somewhere in there was an answer. So our first magical election opportunity is a Western Europe chart, here set for May 28th at 6:51 p.m.ish. And here what we're focused on is the moon, conjoined the midheaven in the 11th Lunar Mansion. Now the 11th Lunar Mansion is one that is primarily focused on, say, career success and advancement. People who are kind of traditionally employed can use this as a means to help them get promoted or recognized for some work to maybe, help them in advancement one way or another. It can be used to help to negotiate a raise or anything like that, just sort of anything that is kind of idealized in one's career, something that you might want to help you advance in your career. For those who are not traditionally employed, those who are kind of self-employed, an 11th Lunar Mansion talisman can still be good to make a good name for yourself in your kind of career community or career field, to help be recognized for your accomplishments and for your work ethic, for the thing that you do, whatever that is. So the 11th Lunar Mansion is really great for anybody who's looking, for advancement or who's looking to kind of fulfill some ambition that they may have. This is a really great tool to help you do that. While the moon is here, conjoined the midheaven in the 11th mansion, she's also applying this sextile to Mercury at the tail end of Gemini. By the time the sextile between the moon and Mercury completes, Mercury will actually be dipped into Cancer, and that's okay. As long as Mercury does not complete an aspect to another planet before the moon catches up to him, then we're fine. Otherwise, we would say that Mercury has escaped the moon, and that this sextile aspect would kind of be rendered invalid as it was frustrated by the kind of interpolation of another planet. But luckily, that's not really going on, so we don't really have to worry about that. On the ascendant, we have the sign Scorpio, which is really great. One of the 6 signs whose ruler is not retrograde, thank goodness. And that's going to point us down here to Mars in the 4th house in Pisces, which is totally fine. Mars is unafflicted by Saturn, not conjoined Saturn. Nothing really bad is happening with Mars. The only kind of meh thing is that we have this square between Mars and the Sun, which can be a little bit damaging to Mars, not, overtly so, not a deal breaker in the same way that a Saturn square is, just a little bit rough, so something to keep in mind moving forward with that. Unfortunately, for North America and Australia at this time, while the same situation is kind of configured very similarly, by the time this happens, the moon will actually be into the 12th lunar mansion, which is not one that we kind of normally consider to be waxing moon appropriate. So that's why North America and Australia don't have a 11th mansion equivalent for their times. But our second and final election opportunity, the one that Australia does have, is actually kind of interesting, and it's one that I don't think I've ever really gotten to talk about before. And here, this is set for June 3rd at around 3:15 p.m.-ish, and we're looking for around, between, say, 7 to 12 degrees Scorpio rising. And this is going to be an example of a 17th Lunar Mansion talisman. So before we get into that, let's just take a look at the election. Here we have the moon within the 17th mansion, rising on the ascendant. We have Scorpio on the ascendant, which is really great because Scorpio is like the only sign that I can use these days, which points us again to Mars, very similar to how we were talking about in the previous electional chart. But now we have the moon applying to the trine of Mars. Woo! But now we have the moon applying to the trine of Mars with reception. Mars receives the moon from his domicile of Scorpio. And that's really great. This is an excellent configuration to have. Kind of the one concerning aspect of this election, something to keep in mind, is that we do have this separating square between, oh my gosh, is that we do have this separating square between Saturn and the moon. It's of course about 7 degrees distant, which is pretty wide. So you definitely have that influence tapering off, but it is still kind of there. So just keep that in mind. You might want to consider moving the ascendant a little bit further into Scorpio to get it kind of separated a little bit more as much as you can. But like I said, I think I've said this in some videos before, I don't necessarily consider aspects of the ascendant to be all that impactful unless they're within 5 degrees of the ascendant. So this 8 degree wide square isn't something that I would really consider as far as damaging the ascendant. Moon-Saturn squares or Moon-Saturn aspects usually will have an orb of around 10-ish degrees. And so obviously 7, we're pretty far away from exactitude, but that is still kind of present, so keep that in mind. But the 17th Lunar Mansion is about protection of resources and protection from thieves. So this can be really good for anybody who is, maybe concerned about theft for one reason or another, maybe somebody who has gone through a burglary of some kind or had something important stolen from them and, obviously doesn't want to go through that again, has developed some sort of anxiety or PTSD-esque symptoms around it. This is going to be really great to ensure that doesn't happen again, or you can even use it to protect specific items by keeping the 17th Lunar Mansion talisman around or in them. Typically one would hang them in the home somewhere to kind of get that protection if around the home in general. But if there's a particular thing that you wanted to protect and keep safe and make sure stayed with you, or you could even include it in your car or vehicle if you are worried about car break-ins or anything like that. The 17th Lunar Mansion is a really great talisman to help protect on that level, specifically from thievery or from people entering the home who are not invited. For that, you can either keep the talisman like hanging on the inside of the door frame or stuck to the door from the inside, or my favorite place to put them is kind of like taped to the bottom of the welcome mat outside of the front door. I think that's a really nice place to put them. Or kind of like I said, stash them in a safe of valuables or important documents that you don't want anything to happen to, or just sort of any kind of prized possession, something that you wouldn't necessarily be able to replace for one reason or another, either due to sentimental value or actual value, something that you just couldn't afford to replace. Definitely consider making this talisman to help protect that. Alright, so that is all of the magical electional opportunities that we have going for us for this 2-week period. Hopefully these 3 retrogrades don't continue to cause problems. I mean, they're going to always kind of be there, and they're going to help decide what planets and signs we can and cannot utilize. But hopefully even through all this, we'll be able to find some good elections to utilize for the next several months while we deal with all these retrograde planets this summer. But take care until next time, and I'll see everybody again on the Sagittarius Full Moon.